I was dealing with a really severe Crohn's colitis flare. It got pretty bad. In my case, I had a $2 million hospital bill. I was monetized by the hospital system. 60% of the revenue from hospitals comes from surgeries. And, I'd venture to say that a reasonable proportion of those surgeries are likely medically unnecessary.
Why are we relying on these bodies to tell us the truth in the world?
My big takeaway would just be
Jacob Peters, welcome to my show. I'm excited to have you here. You're the CEO of Superpower, and I use you as a customer, and I've been very, very impressed with what I've seen so far. But for those of the audience who don't know who you are, could you please give us a quick introduction, your background, and what insights you have today to share with us?
Thanks, Vinny. Excited to be here. So you should listen to this episode because you're probably not, if you're listening, as healthy as you think. I got into the health space after starting a $500 million SaaS company in my early 20s and creating a startup incubator that helped create a few $1 billion in private market cap of value across all the startups that we helped get off the ground. And then I ultimately ended up enduring what was unfortunately a near-death health experience where, because of a number of genetic factors coupled with years and years of poor lifestyle decisions and sacrificing my health to get my businesses off the ground, coupled with kind of the perfect storm of environmental factors, I found myself in the hospital with a $2 million hospital bill and a few surgeries where they had to cut out a few of my organs to save my life. And this all could have been 100% avoided, which has led me on the crusade and ultimately came the catalyst for what I'm building now with Superpower, which we believe is the doctor's clinic of the future and something that can be in the hands of half of America in 10 years.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're still sitting here with us and building what you've built. I've always said that I think you are your own best doctor, and everyone in the world, your primary physician should be yourself. You should know yourself inside out. You should know how your body works, what your markers are. And so let's talk about the primary product. The reason I found you is that people who know that I'm into health and wellness connected me with you because I do a lot of blood tests. I probably go 3 times a year for about 200 different markers. It's actually probably more per year, but my main tests are 3 a year and about 200 markers. And it was a very easy process. I signed up. A phlebotomist came to my house, took my blood, and a couple of days later, all these results are showing up in your website, and you're able to categorize everything from cholesterol to liver function, enzyme function, etc., all the way down. Tell us a little bit about your core product offering at Superpower so we can get a sense of why that's the starting point for your health.
Yeah, and you make a great point about us being our own doctors. So there's this beautiful thing that technology enables across the board, which is this idea of sovereignty, right? And across every industry, we've seen this story play out. Banking, right? You no longer have to be beholden by the traditional financial system, right? You can be your own bank and have a Bitcoin wall on the blockchain, right? And this is happening in every different type of vertical, right? You don't need a financial advisor. You can be your own. Medicine and healthcare is the next domino to fall here, except it hasn't happened yet because it's a very complicated, regulated industry. And only now is do the infrastructure tools and the digital tools exist to be able to build great consumer experiences in healthcare that can connect dots that for people that weren't previously being connected. And also there's a really exciting crop of engineering, design, and business building talent that's flooding into the space, which is kind of the philosophy that we're looking to bring to the healthcare world with Superpower. The way the product experience works today is we're basically trying to do all the things that traditional medicine isn't really able nor incentivized or knowledgeable enough to be able to do right now. And there's this kind of heuristic idea that's generally pretty commonly accepted within healthcare and medicine today, which is this idea of the 19-year gap, meaning that traditional kind of standard primary care protocols or emergency room protocols or the care you'd get at a hospital or a health system or from a kind of layman doctor is about 19 to 20 years behind the frontier of the science. And there's a lot of reasons why things basically have been innovating fast and things haven't kept up. And there's frictions with legal risk, we have a very litigious society. So physicians are very risk off and health systems are risk off. It's also the fact that you don't really get much formal training beyond, medical school and residency programs. And there's no time nor incentive for physicians to stay abreast with the edge of the research. So these things just take time, right? And then the last thing is, it just takes a while for the scientific community to kind of come to a consensus. And ultimately, when it comes to science, there is ultimately no fact. It's all just kind of like a series of probabilistic judgments. So it's hard for people to kind of collectively make, call us what's actually legit versus what's not. But what's happening is we're at this really interesting inflection point where, because of just the, compounding effect of innovation and understanding and knowledge accumulation that's happened because of the internet and because of more smart people and flooding into the health space, I think we're at the beginning of an exponential part of the J curve where that 19-year gap is, going to become a 50, 60-year gap very, very shortly, because our understanding is advancing exponentially faster than the kind of system's ability to incorporate all this new healthcare information. So what we've done really, modeled after a lot of what high-end concierge doctors do, who have full-time research teams to stay on the bleeding edge of what's happening in science and incorporating into their clinical models. We basically built an engine of dozens of these doctors who were working with them to get their brains into our system. Plus we have our own research team that is going out and kind of staying aware of what's on the frontier and bring all of that into our clinical model. And it makes it so that we can start this patient experience and this member experience with getting a complete understanding of everything that's happening in your body and your life and your history, marrying that with the latest and advanced diagnostic testing, and ultimately using it to create an N of one personalized plan. And this is very, antithetical to the way that a lot of traditional primary care medicine has been delivered, right? So again, everything is sort of by the protocol. It's one size fits all, and it's generally just a pharmaceutical solution that you're offered. A good example of this, at the most kind of rudimentary and basic level, is what Hims and Roe have done, right? They've taken discrete use cases or things that you'd get from a primary care doctor, and they've unbundled it, discretized it, and built a product experience around it where the human is fungible. So let's take hair loss as an example, right? You have a hair loss problem, you go to hims.com, you go to Roe, you fill out a 4-question questionnaire, a doctor checks a box, and you get your pharmaceutical for topical hair loss or whatever, right? It's a one-size-fits-all formula, and they're just basically checking the boxes without really understanding anything about you. And that's, obviously a scaled version of what a primary care or traditional doctor might be doing across a lot of different conditions. Now contrast that with the future that we're building towards and the ultimate personalized patient experience that we want to create with Superpower. You could imagine us taking, instead of a 4-question, data set, we could take 30 questions, everything from hey, did your father or mother die of heart disease or liver cancer, married with what is sort of your level of toxin exposure in your environment? Are you sleeping in polyester bed sheets, which can disrupt your hormones at night? Do you sleep with your door closed? That could basically change the carbon dioxide levels in your room, which can affect your heart rate variability and the quality of your sleep, all the way to, do you have certain genetic SNPs, or just what even is your blood biomarker trend line looking like for a few very key markers that are indicative of your habits and lifestyle, right? Your HbA1c, which measures, kind of your glucose pattern over and insulin spiking and blood sugar spiking over the past prior few months. And you took all of that information, and then not only did you use that information to provide a personalized recommendation that's not cookie cutter, one size fits all, and just a basic pharmaceutical, but you actually had a holistic plan that was a pharmaceutical plus 4 supplements to correct key nutrient deficiencies, plus some natural thyroid medication to correct an imbalanced thyroid, which could be contributing to the hair loss. Plus 4 different lifestyle routine changes that could very much impact your level of healthfulness, getting sunlight first thing in the morning or getting more sunlight on your scalp. Which again, all things that theoretically, you should be doing to correct that problem. So
what you're really saying is a more holistic approach to health.
Yeah.
Because the problem with drugs is you take one thing and it upsets another part of, basically it disrupts homeostasis in the body, right? Your body starts doing different things because this medication is impacting you in ways that have, in fact, most of the drugs, when you listen to these ads on TV, it gives you this warning of can cause this for 25 seconds of the ad. Be careful, you can die of this, you could die of that. And that's because pretty much all the studies done with these synthetic drugs have side effects, and these side effects, then you think something else is wrong with you, so you take another drug. And I had another guest on the show where we were talking about the fact that, when you have these drugs piling up. By the time you get to 70 or 80, you're taking 20 drugs.
Yeah.
And most of them are just to combat some sort of side effect that the original 1 or 2 drugs were taking.
Let's click into this. How crazy the pharmaceutical industry really is, and applied to this specific example you brought up. And I've gone quite deep into this with a few kind of key leaders we brought around the table to help build our company and our understanding of healthcare. And then I've invested in a number of kind of biotech and frontier therapeutic companies. So have like a sense of how this model works. And for a lot of drugs, when they get to like the later phases of clinical trials before they actually become commercialized and brought on the market, when they test for symptoms and side effects, a lot of times it's purely anecdotal. They're not running the Superpower baseline blood test, where they send a nurse to you and measure 80 different biomarkers across, effectively a really wide smattering of your organ systems. There may be, if they're testing at all, a few things. There may be some like rudimentary biomarkers, a few CBC, CMP blood tests, which are, again, just like maybe your blood cell counts and things, but they're just missing data points. Yeah. So these drugs are getting pushed through with having a very incomplete understanding of the downstream ramifications of how they might be impacting the body, which is frankly really scary. The other thing is a lot of drugs, they've been around for decades and decades, but we didn't even have this level of like testing back then. So new things are coming out now around like, the downsides of even things like statins, which are, very popular, commonly prescribed drug. And yes, if you're in imminent risk of heart disease, like even the kind of integrative medicine doctors that I work with who are generally anti-statin, they'll sometimes come around and say, okay, in some cases it's necessary. But the reality is, it has effects that we're just now starting to understand because we have these new advanced testing methodologies that like were never, used nor required by pharmaceutical companies during the later stages of clinical trials to effectively, determine the safety of these drugs.
Hi, this is Vinny. Thank you for being a viewer or subscriber to my channel. And if you are a viewer and not a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. I love producing content for you guys, and I really, really appreciate all the feedback and the comments that you post. I want to hear from you about which guests you want to see on my show, and more importantly, which questions you want to ask them. I'm going to try my best to get them on just for you. Thanks so much, and now back to the show.
So before we continue, I want to just double click on your hair loss points early on. So about a year ago, I started noticing like thinning of my hair loss issues, and I went to Hims. And I had no consultation with the doctor. I ordered it, and it arrived, and I started doing some research on, I think it was finasteride and minoxidil.
Topical or oral?
Topical. Yeah. I don't take oral stuff. So I got this stuff that I started using. And then obviously all the dangers with it, right? When you stop using it, you're going to start losing your hair, blah, blah, blah. And I started applying it, and what I found was I started getting like, the scalp became sensitive, so I started feeling like a little sore, but it wasn't terrible. The hair started growing back, and but it wasn't like great results. It was okay. And then I started also doing research around it and found that obviously gut dysbiosis is a big problem. So I said, okay, let me focus on my gut for a bit. So I focused on some gut stuff, did some gut tests, took some antibiotics, cleared out whatever was there, and that kind of helped a bit, but not enough. And eventually I just went off the Hims, and I switched to a plant-based product from Honduras called Batana oil.
Yeah,
you've heard of that?
Yeah,
and it's worked wonders. I mean, I've been on it for maybe 6 months, and my hair hasn't looked better for me in a long time. It's thicker. I'm off the prescription drugs. I'm off the Hims. I use it 4 or 5 days a week. I rub it into my scalp. And between correcting the gut dysbiosis and then re-nourishing the roots and the scalp of my hair, I was able to fix the problem. And it's back to normal. And so that's just an example of like, I mean, I'm not digging on Hims or anything like that, but the pharmaceutical...
I'm down to dig on Hims.
You can, fine. But the pharmaceutical industry makes money on a subscription product like that where you're paying for it every single month for years and years and not solving the root cause. Excuse the pun. But I was able to figure out that it's for me it was either it's a gut issue, or it's something in the scalp, and I attacked it from both sides and naturally solved the problem.
Yeah, it's a brilliant point. People deserve N of 1 personalized root cause medicine, and this is so far from the standard today.
That's a big issue. So okay, so let's move on to the next question I've got for you. So when you look at guys like Brian Johnson, okay, and his quest for immortality, and he's I think he calls it a don't die movement, right? What should people be focusing on? The length of your life or the quality of your life? I know you. I guess you're trying to like balance the two out, but what's more important for you? Do you think right now?
Yeah, for me personally, I'm like less concerned with, the end goal, so to speak. I more try to focus on how do I feel every single day and like what does that unlock for me from a performance standpoint. And there's a framework that I've been going back to lately, which is what are like the visible things that are suboptimal and wrong with your health, and then like the invisible things. And I think the problem that I see that's pretty ubiquitous right now is people are way too focused on like this just like nebulous end state idea of longevity, or they have the opposite problem, which is like they're like I'm healthy, right? I feel fine, I feel good, but here's how the brain really, really works. It's amazing at adapting to our circumstances, and like you kind of recalibrate to your baseline. And like if your health visibly, you might feel okay because your brain has like recalibrated and said, hey, this is the new normal, like I'm fine, I feel good. But you almost don't know like how good you could actually feel if you dialed a few different levers. And then the reason for that is because there's this like invisible side of things that you don't know about, right? Like if you have a bunch of key nutrient deficiencies, because the brain is good at like adapting, you're not going to notice any symptoms. A lot of these things don't even have symptoms because
backup systems.
It's backup systems, right? Like the body recalibrates. It's why when I go to San Francisco and I see people who like haven't showered in months, or on the street, like God bless them, but like they're
never seen one of those.
Yeah. But like it's I'm like, how are these people living, off of effectively, like low nutrient quality meals, 2, 3, 4 hours of sleep in the street? And it's because like the body is actually like amazingly resilient at changing up its biological or biochemical pathways in order to just like, keep you on living, right? And that's an extreme example, right? Of someone who's
but I think it's actually not an extreme example. I think it's actually the human body adapts well to extreme situations. So this is why when we do cold plunges, or we do hot saunas, or we go fasting, these are extreme stresses that we're placing on our body, and it adapts to that in ways which are positive for us because it builds up a level of resistance to that extremity. And that's why people can push themselves harder, longer, faster when they're doing sprinting or sports. It's because your body adapts to it. So if you keep your body in a comfort zone the whole time, it doesn't learn to adapt to the extremes. The moment you push the extremes, those stresses create a reaction in your body in different neural pathways. And those stresses on your body are actually in some ways healthier. So someone living on the street, that's a stressor, but they're not dying necessarily.
Yeah. And this is, like I have a great deal of respect for what Brian Johnson has done to bring, just excitement and kind of mainstream acclaim or criticism. But, I think all press is good press in a sense. And I'm a big believer in, this broader movement of like, we need to have more attention on our health, and he's done great things there. But from like a medical perspective, the integrative trained doctors who I work with, their kind of criticism with his routine is that it doesn't allow for hormesis, which is this idea that like you want to kind of be like, constantly shocking the body with different routines, patterns, diverse types of nutrients, because the body can basically like adapt to certain types of, like certain pathways become like, calcified in a sense. I don't mean calcified in like the literal, biochemical sense. I mean more like in the abstract, figurative sense. Like your body becomes dependent on certain nutrients coming in at certain times every single day. It's why I switch up my supplement routine. Like I'm not taking the same things every single week. I do it randomly on purpose.
I do the same thing. So I have all my supplements and I rotate through that. And my wife will look at my supplements and say, you take all of this every day? I'm like, not every day, but I rotate. And you have to rotate. So some days I won't take certain things. Like, for example, I have beef supplement pills. So on days that I'm eating fish, I'll throw in some like extra liver from the pills because, just to mix it up, right? So I don't always eat the same food every day either. And you got to mix up the supplementation. And when I travel sometimes, I just don't take some pills with. I take a week off, no supplements.
I call it a supplement holiday.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
I don't take vacations. I take supplement holidays.
I take very few things that I take every single day. Without fail, but most things you have to rotate through it, and now and again I'll chuck in some new things just because I think I totally agree with you on that. What timeline do you think is out there for people to move to personalized health? So I'm an early adopter. You're an early adopter. We have tons of friends who are, but not like I would say maybe 5% of my friends do this. Maybe 5. Most of them don't. They kind of go to their doctor once a year. They do their annual meds. They don't really take, like, if you walk into my room and look at my supplement, and I'll show you in a bit. But if you look at my supplement stack, it's like I'm deemed as crazy by my friends because I take so many supplements and I have so much interest in all this stuff. But that's me. When does this actually go mainstream where people start caring about this enough that they do it for themselves?
We're early.
Yeah.
So the way I've seen, like, having lived through a few different tech cycles, right? And tech is a really interesting like subset of the broader market because everything moves so fast, right? So I've seen a few tech cycles in the last decade of being in startups and building companies, and it's never all at once shift. It's basically like the compounding, right, of a bunch of little kind of micro innovations and understandings. Let's take an example of what's happened in like even the past month, right? Like all my friends who are not even that interested in health yet, they've started, I see them on social media and group chats I'm in and just over dinner conversations talking about microplastics in water bottles, right? Or nanoplastics is what they found, right? We've all known about microplastics for a while, but it's kind of a meme, honestly. But there's now new research that, is coming out and it's pretty damning. I mean, I'm seeing this stuff on like, when I go to my parents' house and they're watching, CNBC or Fox or CNN, like it's on mainstream television now, right? That you get basically hundreds of millions of particles of nanoplastics every time you drink a bottle of water. And like that stuff is provably bad, right? It's provably endocrine disrupting. And there was even studies that came out literally like 4 days ago that people who had, atherosclerosis and like plaque building up in their arteries and, having challenges with their heart, they found that like 100% of those people, the composition was not basically just like, calcium or other deposits. It was actually partly made of like nanoplastics.
So we've known this for a while. It's actually funny. I'm smiling and laughing at you because literally when we filmed the episode yesterday, exact same topic came up, and this is an issue people don't appreciate. Like I have no plastic bottles in my house. I only use the Yeti aluminum cans. Yeah. I carry water on. I have a hydrogen filter downstairs. I have a reverse osmosis throughout the whole house. So I'm always drinking.
Is this reverse osmosis?
Yes, it is. That might even be hydrogen.
I see the bubbles.
Yeah, it's hydrogen. Yeah, hydrogen water. So, we basically like cut out all plastics. When I travel, I rarely have bottles of water. If I have water, I look for hard plastic bottles. So Fiji, typically, I stay away from the recycled plastic bottles because that's even worse. Because now it's been oxidized and whatever else multiple times. And I think this is a big issue. And I actually picked this up, and I made this point in the previous episode. I picked this up because my estradiol levels are spiking, and the doctor couldn't figure out why.
Wow.
And we looked into it and everything else is fine. So all my other hormone levels were perfectly fine. But this estradiol is going up. And then they said to me, look, it might be plastic. You might have plastics in your system. I'm like, well, gee, I drink 12 plastic bottles of water a day. I stopped it.
Did you get a toxin test?
I didn't actually bother going that far. I just cut out plastic bottles. Yeah. Initially, I cut it out like maybe 70%, 80%. Now I'm down to 99% of my year. I do not drink water. If I go to a restaurant and it's like water out of a plastic bottle, I just get tap water instead. Now, it's probably 50-50 because the tap water is not obviously great in most places. And if I go overseas, and I'd rather actually just have a juice or something at that point. I'm really parched. But I have Voss water, Aquapana when I'm in restaurants. I stay away from plastic bottles as much as possible. And the biggest issue is that these bottles sit in the sun. Yep. And people don't realize that they sit in these trucks and they go to Costco or wherever, and you buy these Kirkland bottles, which is extremely thin plastic, and it's been sitting and cooking in the sun already for hours a day on a truck and heating up, and now you've got plastics. And so now that I've been off plastic bottles and water so much, I can taste the plastic in the water.
Yes.
And it makes me sick immediately.
It is so funny you bring that up because I taste it as well now too. So when I drink an aluminum can of water, like Liquid Death or something, like I maybe I'm just, a little bit neurotic, but like you kind of have to be, right? In order to keep yourself healthy in this, like this unfortunately toxic environment we live in, but I can really taste the BPA.
Because the aluminum can has got plastic.
It's all lined with
lined with plastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. I will say that the aluminum cans are somewhat better for some reason, because I think somehow it keeps the heat. It doesn't degrade it as much. But I agree with you. But I had a bottle of Aquafina through the airport the other day. I didn't have a choice. I was like stuck in no water. There's no refill fountain. I was thirsty, and I was feeling nauseous within like an hour, like really badly. I thought I was going to throw up. So I'm definitely like, but even the liquid death in the cans, I'm off that now. Like, again, what do you do when you're starving or you're thirsty and you're like in a desert? Effectively, I was in Vegas. Like, what do? You have to have some water, right? At that point, like, yeah, but finding a bottle, I even do the bottles of iced tea and stuff. If you can find the iced tea bottles, because those are normally quite thick bottles. Just find a thick
glass
bottle.
I wish they made more water in glass bottles. I think the government needs to bring back, some sort of like incentive and recycling program.
Agreed.
To get everything to move back to glass like it was in the 40s.
So you look at what's going on since the 40s to now and how our health has declined. Plastic's a big part of that.
Yeah.
Plastics and seed oils.
And
Anyway.
we actually, so my research team, we see so much about seed oils, and we've decided to dig in. We're going to release this in a few weeks. So
really?
I'll
We're doing an episode on that too as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we should
collab.
We're trying to come out with like, what is just like, the canonical, kind of source of truth, or at least like put all the different conflicting data points all in one, long form essay to help people decide for themselves, right? Like, where does kind of the seed oil debate start and stop? But going back to your question, which is like, when is this going to become the mainstream, right? Like personalized medicine and holistic medicine, where you look at every aspect of your health, from like, what are you predisposed to genetically, to like how are your lifestyle factors, and like everything from the plastics you're drinking to like the level you're exercising impacting your health, all the way to like what does your actual biochemistry at this point in time say about your body, and using that to make health decisions. It's going to happen through all these like, small like discrete pieces of awareness that continue to come up and happen, right? It's nanoplastics today. Maybe it was PFAs a while ago. Things are going to start to come out when you have people on podcasts and influencers and people in popular culture talking about, some of the twisted incentives in healthcare. Like, in my case, I'm going to be sharing my story a bit more publicly pretty soon. So this is a bit of a teaser, but like, I was monetized by the hospital system. In my case, I had a $2 million hospital bill, literally as big as a pre-seed round these days, because like 60% of the revenue from hospitals comes from surgeries.
Yeah.
And, I'd venture to say that, at least, I don't want to say all, and again, I want to be cautious of the way I word this, but like I'd say at least a reasonable proportion of those surgeries are like likely medically unnecessary. So in my case, I was dealing with a really severe Crohn's colitis flare, which, for those listening who aren't as familiar, it's basically an autoimmune disease where your own body starts attacking your colon and your digestive tract and your organs. It got pretty bad. And, I was basically told by, the gastro team that I was working with at the hospital while I was stuck there, for like weeks and weeks and weeks, that the only thing that they can do is cut out the organ in order to stop the flaring. Because eventually, if you leave this thing festering for months and months, like you can basically die, right? Of like what's called toxic megacolon, which is when your colon swells up really large and, you're going to be then in impending risk of death. And, they decided to like, push the surgery on me, which, was going to make them millions of dollars, both from the surgeries itself. There was like 3 to 7 surgeries that you have to do because they have to cut out different pieces of your stomach at different times. And then they are going to make, a killing on like the post-operative care, right? Like you have to go to see all these different types of nurses to help you with like, the post-care after they do this operation. It's just, it's a huge mess.
Did they resection it?
They actually completely removed my colon to rectum. So I have like no, lower digestive tract. It's pretty gnarly. But they made a lot of money on me now. And they did it by, again, not addressing the root cause of what was causing the immune system flare up, because they don't even know. But instead just like cutting it out via the surgery. After I went through this entire experience and, kind of started to discover the frontier of medicine by working with, a handful of these like concierge integrative medicine, meaning like they look at, your whole body physicians who help, people with really complex cases, or even just like help people who have money and are in the know with like, increasing their longevity. Basically all the stuff we do at Superpower, but like, for 100x the price. I started working with a lot of these doctors, and thankfully I was in like a blessed financial, position where I could, spend my own personal capital to heal and to learn. And I was told by one of my physicians that she had seen, quote, a dozen other people with pretty much my exact condition. And like the disease had progressed to like, the same exact state, more or less. And she only lost one colon. The other 11, she's able to save with a protocol of like less than, $15,000, consisting of everything from like hyperbaric oxygen, which, is literally insurance approved for diabetes therapy because it's wound healing, right? And if your stomach has ulcers and wounds in it, you could heal that. Plus a handful of peptides, which are just these like naturally occurring chains of amino acids in the body that can help with healing, plus balancing your microbiome with a few key targeted, like bacteria like Akkermansia and these things that like can basically help, quell the inflammation in your gut from a bacterial perspective, addressing some key nutrient deficiencies that I had, removing some high levels of toxins. I had like a mercury level that was like 8 times the even like safe upper limit, which I think the safe upper limit should be 0 because that stuff shouldn't be in our bodies. Plus a bunch of mold and mycotoxin, poisoning because I'd been exposed to mold and it was just hiding out in all my mucous membranes and a really messed up central nervous system. And she's like, here's how we would have, recalibrated that effectively, right? Through everything from like vagal nerve stimulation to just like having better mental frameworks for dealing with stress, everything from cognitive behavioral therapy to just like learning to like be aware of the state that your nervous system, your body is in, and like, kind of getting yourself to calm down and chill out. And like, that's the protocol, if you want to address the root cause of, something like severe autoimmune disease by healing the lining of the gut, rebalancing the microbiome, addressing the key nutrient deficiencies that you have in your body so that your basically immune system has like a fighting chance, right? Because anytime you have to fight something, it's literally depleting nutrients in order to like, keep things going, and ultimately like lowering your stress levels and like keeping your body in like a much more calm, rest and digest state versus kind of being always on and triggered. And like that's, the formula I should have been given, but the system would have made, again, like 200x less money off that or 2000x less money. And they also just didn't know about it because of this like 19-year gap that we've discussed.
Wow. So how do you function now without the colon? How's your diet changed?
Yeah, so the weirdest thing.
I'm sorry to hear. This is like a horror story.
Yeah,
I'm like still sitting in shock because someone young and healthy like you should not have to have gone through that.
Yeah, thanks, Vinny. So the biggest change, and I'm kind of like a weird N of 1 like medical specimen. So I'm truly like I need the platform we're building, right? Like I'm building this for myself.
Yeah.
And not just for myself who's had to deal with this horrible disease, but like for everybody else who like should never have to go through not just anything similar, but like not even just like you settle for complacency or mediocrity or like whatever the current status of their health is. Like we want to take people from baseline to fully healed state across like every single dimension, and people don't even know where to start, right? And in my case, one of the biggest challenges I deal with not having a colon is that my small intestine has sort of adapted and changed its function to be like a hybrid colon, small intestine, like hybrid organ basically. Mm-hmm. So the purpose of the colon is basically to like hold stool, house some of your microbiome where like, basically the microbial populations can create things like different hormones and neurotransmitters and things in your body. It can absorb some nutrients as well. But its kind of main purpose in my, the way I look at it is just like absorbing water and like keeping you hydrated, right? It's like, not to get too graphic, but it's why stool is like really, really hard, or it should be at least a little firmer. It's because your body's literally pulling water out of your colon and bringing it into the rest of your body so that you can stay hydrated. And then your small intestine is mainly absorbing nutrients. That's basically what it's doing. In my case, because I don't have that function, when I first got the surgery, I was like hella dehydrated for like weeks and weeks. Like even when I would drink water, I would actually feel more dehydrated. So I had to take basically like a fuck ton of electrolyte powder.
But that doesn't help. That makes it worse, doesn't it?
Well, no, the electrolyte powder was helping. But like basically what was happening is my body had to like adapt, literally like epigenetically change on the spot just to keep me alive and hydrated, where my small intestine, my body was basically, hey, small intestine, you now have to change your job up. Instead of just absorbing nutrients, you have to start also absorbing water. So what that means is like now my small intestine is kind of doing double duty. It's like maybe half the time absorbing nutrients and the other half the time absorbing water. And if it's not absorbing nutrients 100% of the time, it means I'm not going to get as much nutrients from my food. So I've had to basically adjust my diet completely to eat like way more calories just to like, keep the same level of weight and muscle that that I want to take way more nutrients. So I have like this like rice bran powder that like, one of my doctors gives to a lot of her, nutrient deprived cancer patients that I take, every morning, which has just like a ton of nutrients. I take like extra supplements and vitamins and nutrients. And then I'm just like crushing, these like electrolyte powders every single day to keep myself hydrated.
Interesting, because I know if I take too much electrolyte powders, it makes basically you have watery stools because obviously you have excess water to get through. But help me understand that the microbiome that doesn't exist anymore in your colon that's missing, obviously, your small intestine is supposed to be sterile. You're not supposed to have gut bacteria in there.
Yes. So this is again why like I'm sort of a weird animal specimen and trying to figure this out. So because I think what happens, and I've dug into this, it's so crazy that like they literally will do this surgery on you, tell you it's life-saving, and then not educate you at all. And to be fair, they just don't know. But again, it's because of the incentives that we've talked about in the research gap. So I've actually had to like employ my own functional researcher who sat down and like read hundreds of papers and is just going out to all these esoteric communities and reading these Substacks, and they go to conferences, entire conferences around like kind of frontier understanding of the microbiome to come back and like help me understand what's actually happening in my body. And we suspect that the microbiome has actually like migrated partly into my small intestine. So again, I have this like weird hybrid
throughout
organ.
the whole track or just some part of it?
Probably the bottom end of the track.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So
because the neurotransmitters, the dopamine, all that stuff that gets generated in your gut now has to be, you're still functioning, you're still speaking, you seem like a happy
my personality
guy.
didn't change. So like
exactly.
The one thing that did change, which is probably for the better, and I'm actually weirdly grateful that this entire situation unfolded, is I now genuinely just have like a unbridled fearlessness for like anything that life throws at me. And the reason for that is because, and I've spoken to other people who have gone through like similar life-threatening situations, and we're kind of weirdly like the only people that also understand this, but like being faced with your own mortality fundamentally alters the perception from which you like perceive day-to-day reality. Like it fucks with your mind forever, I think, in a positive way, because I'm much more grateful and like fearless of anything that gets thrown at me.
I think it applies to you as you get older as well. I mean,
I'm young. I'm 29, so
So I'm 45 now, and I started learning how to fly recently, and I've always been scared of being in a small propeller plane flying around the sky and like, oh my gosh. But as you get older, you're like faced with your own mortality. You're like, well, I only have how many years left? Like I'm probably at least 50% through my life if I live a good life.
Not if Superpower can help you.
If you can help, maybe more. But like maybe when I was 20 or 15, I'd be like a little bit more scared. I'm like, oh, I got my whole life ahead of me. Now I'm like, well, I don't have that much in terms of my good health years. They're probably mostly behind me, obviously. I may have another 10, 15, 20 years ahead of me, but doing new things and stuff which would make me scared previously is becoming a little easier for me, because I'm like, well, I've lived a good life so far. How many years I've left? I think it's the same thing when you have these near-death experiences. You become a little bit more fearless because you just accept death as, if it happens, it happens, right?
I think that's definitely a part of it. I think there is an aspect though of like being so close. Like it's almost like we kind of take health for granted.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you're not in a hospital bed for 3 months, like where your mind is, effectively on a different plane of existence than your body, and there's like this big disconnect, right? Like my mind was pretty much rock solid and fine the entire time. Like, believe it or not, I was not, in some spiraling depression. I was actually like the opposite. I was like hyper positive, and everyone that would come visit me in the hospital when I even could get visitors, were like, wow, you seem like in such great spirits. Like, you're really kicking. But my body was like down here, and it was this like strange dissonance where I was just like, my brain was basically functioning optimally, and like my body was not on the same level. And it's a really tough thing to describe, but it just makes you grateful for like the days, that you do have like normal functioning. I think maybe that's the key difference, between maybe just like fearlessness from old age versus something like this. I mean, it was so profound. Like when I finally got out of the hospital, and after like a few months of recovery post-surgery, like I went running for the first time. I cried for the first time in my adult life. Like I uncontrollable, like, tears just like streaming down my face. I'm like, this is what it feels like to be able to do normal things again with my body.
That's great. So what do you eat now? What is your diet consist on? Like given your situation, and how has your diet changed before you had your surgery and to now? What's different?
So I've become much more educated on, what's supremely good for the body. So my diet pretty much consists of a handful of vegetables, like sweet potatoes and a few different leafy greens that I don't believe to be phytotoxic, because that's another big discussion we could have. And again,
but let's talk about that. So which leafy greens and which ones do you think are phytotoxic and which ones are not?
Yeah, I don't really eat too much broccoli, believe it or not.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah. I really like onions and asparagus. And here's the thing with food and nutrition. It's so, dogmatic.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a function of the fact that it's complicated, right? It's a very large mathematical space. Food is code for the body. Mm-hmm. And, all you're basically doing is matching up all the different pathways that your body needs for nutrients, and then all the nutrient compositions of what these foods have. And some of these in vegetables aren't necessarily as good for us as we might think. So the functional nutritionists that I work with, they've kind of given me this list of what I eat, what I don't. Fruits, I pretty much mostly eat everything. I think fruits are amazing. I'm actually not that scared about my blood sugar spiking from fruits, because when I notice that I eat fruits, because a lot of them have fiber content, even things like oranges, it actually doesn't spike my glucose as much. When we have CGMs, glucose monitors that we can send you. There we go. Now. Yeah, we have them on Superpower now, right? And we pull all that data into your ecosystem. But I noticed that my blood sugar is not spiking quite as much when I'll eat something that's a little bit more fibrous as a fruit. So I eat plenty of fruit. I stack it with macadamia nut butter oftentimes, because again the fat can help blunt.
I had a banana.
Did you eat it with macadamia nut?
No, I had a protein shake with banana.
Okay. Yeah, but I'll even notice when I eat macadamia nut butter, for example, which is very low in polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is the kind of fat.
That's the best nut, by the way. Number one nut by far.
It's really, really great. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg was just talking about he wants to start a macadamia nut tree farm. Maybe he already has one.
No, he already has one. He feeds his cattle macadamia nuts. Okay. And it's I would love to get some of that steak. Zach, if you're watching, I'd love an invitation to Hawaii. I really want to try the steak.
Yeah. We are what we eat. Yes. It's like an aphorism for a reason, because when you feed cattle really low quality food, or corn and soy and all these different things, it changes the ultimate underlying chemical structure of the proteins and the fats that you end up eating. So cattle that are fed macadamia nuts in their diets, or grass even, it's going to have a much healthier balance of saturated to polyunsaturated to monounsaturated fats that I like to have in my diet. So when it comes to fish, which I also eat, it's a real problem now that we have to screen our seafood for mercury and toxin metals. So there's a company that I invested in called Seatopia.
I'm a customer.
You are?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's epic. Yeah. It's great because they sell.
Actually, we're having Seatopia fish for lunch today.
We are. Okay.
I do my research.
Yeah. This made my day. But it's a great platform. I wasn't paid to say this, but I will disclose I have a vested interest in the company. But they're really cool because they have a fish farm process where they guarantee that there is no mercury or microplastics or any of these harmful toxins that eventually have been finding their way into our water streams and our fish supply.
It's literally the only fish I have. I mean, obviously when I travel, I can't hold on a bag of fish with me, but if I eat out, but at home, this is all we eat
and this is going to be a big consumer category. What I mean by that is toxin-free food as a marketing slogan.
Yes.
So the salt I use, guess what their slogan is? Microplastic-free salt.
I've got that downstairs as well.
The Vera.
I'm not sure the same brand, but I've got microplastic-free salt.
Yeah, it's probably the same one. So anyway, we have that on the Superpower marketplace. Part of the thing we're trying to build is also just a curated ecosystem of trusted, toxin and free and additive free.
It makes a difference. I mean, when I say to people when I go on this I go on the same tirade, why do you eat microplastics in your food? Oh, well, I don't feel bad. Okay, would you mind if I put 1/100th of a lethal dose of arsenic in your food every day? No, it's crazy. It's poison. Same thing. Yeah. The dose makes the poison, right? And so that's the issue here. People are willing to take in very small amounts of something which is poisonous because it's in low doses. But the moment you say it's a big brand name poison like arsenic, then it's like, oh, that's terrible, or mercury or whatever. But this stuff is lethal for you at high enough doses, and it accumulates in your blood, in your body, in your tissues. It is poisonous, and it is harmful even on a micro scale. Even when you get down to, there are a lot of people go on about like homeopathic medicine, and I've seen it actually work in a number of instances. But because you look at the titration rates and it becomes down to like there's not even a molecule in it. At that point, I'm probably like, yeah, okay, I agree. But even some of the homeopathic medication where there's just like 5-10 parts per million. That's like some of the levels that you see in blood for other medication or other pathogens where it actually causes a problem. You have like, hey, you have like 15 parts per million of this pathogen in your blood. It's causing problems. So why wouldn't a medication that had a similar concentration not counteract that? And I think that when we look at nanoplastics and microplastics and the concentrations in ppms, even though they're extremely low, they're harmful.
Yeah.
So I struggle with the scientific community on this, because you can't have it both ways. You can't say that this is harmful at low doses, but this is not beneficial at low doses.
Yes, and there's a few like discrete problems here that we should talk about why there's these standards, who created these standards, how influenced were those standards, right? Like I was watching the news the other night, them talking about the nanoplastic, prevalence that's now in all these bottled waters, and like the statement they had on the screen was a blurb from the National Bottled Water Association saying that there are no provable studies that nanoplastics are harmful to human health. And it's like, well, one, just because there's no studies yet, but also it's those studies would have to get funded. The association's never going to fund those things. If there were studies that even said it was safe, would you trust it if the associations were funding it? I mean, no. And then the next problem is that the kind of, I guess, kind of mainstream medical establishment, might say because there's no studies, we can't, comment on the efficacy, which is also a problem.
Why are we relying on these bodies to tell us the truth in the world?
Yeah.
Why are we relying on organizations that are funded by special interest groups that have it makes no sense to me if you're not doing your own research and actually looking at the data, the anecdotal data, and what just makes sense theoretically.
So again, all this stuff is starting to come out now, right? At least in the fringe, more fringe, niche communities that we're in on Twitter and in the tech industry and the group chats we're part of, or the Substacks we subscribe to, this stuff is starting to come out. Yeah. It's going to become more mainstream. Consumers are going to start to become aware and educated, and they're going to be frustrated. And and within the next decade, I see hopefully a flippening happen.
Yes.
Right, where people really buy into this idea of health sovereignty. And decide to start making decisions for themselves, or maybe there's going to be companies that pop up like what we're doing. That our clinical opinion is basically no level of toxin is safe.
Yeah, exactly. You should. I take brown seaweed every day because I eat a lot of fish, and I'm taking less now because I take the Cetopia fish. I know it's mercury free, but my mercury levels were too high. They were 16, and so I've been taking brown seaweed to try and flush it out. But then also migrating away from eating out and sushi and whatever else.
What I've been doing is going in the sauna.
Sauna's good.
In the morning, but taking a binder beforehand, which something like charcoal or
charcoal's great. Yeah.
That can help bind to the metals and excrete them from your body so that they don't recirculate.
I use the coconut charcoal.
Yeah,
activated coconut charcoal.
The funny thing with the sauna is I was doing it before bed for the longest time, and my sleep was getting worse, and I realized it's because my heart rate was getting jumped up. So now I do it in the morning.
What temperature do you get up
to? At least 180. That's where you start to see.
Which sauna do you have that gets that high?
Even if it's 145, you're still getting the benefits of detox, from my understanding. But
you have to spend longer in there as well.
But you're not getting the cardiac benefits because it actually simulates a low intensity workout.
Yeah. How long do you stay in the sauna for at 185? Because that's really hot.
Yeah, not more than 20 minutes.
Okay, I have a real hot button when it comes to health right now, and that's seed oils. I personally have gone through hell before I cut seed oils out of my diet. I went and had fried chicken the one day. And the next morning I woke up and both my arms were lame. I couldn't feel anything else. Inflammation was all over. It's literally I had to tap my arms to get blood flow back into my arms so I could feel again. And it happened quite a few times. And I never put two and two together. And then the chicken incident happened, and then it was a big, corn-fed steak. But it's never one thing. It's this accumulation over weeks and weeks of eating seed oils in your diet. So canola oils, etc. And when it accumulates to a certain tipping point, your HSCRP goes up. It was like 4 point something. Mine's down to 1.7 right now. And the standard American diet, I think people are around 15 to 20 times, so your 6-to-3 ratio of omegas. So when you get your body to those levels of information, things start going wonky. I cut out all seed oils out of my diet. Literally, the only time I have a seed oil is when I inadvertently have to. And again, we travel, we have to go places. You can't always be pedantic about it, otherwise you'll probably starve. But I have seen magnificent results cutting seed oils out of my diet. And so let's talk about seed oils for a bit. And what do you think is the issue with seed oils in general? I mean, the 6-to-3 ratio is one problem. The chemicals, I guess, is cutting that they use are now stuck in the seed oils. And then also the products on the shelf. They did a study recently of all the extra virgin olive oils on the shelves, and they were all not pure.
Yeah.
So I'd love to just spend, the floor is yours. Give me your take for the next couple of minutes on how this is becoming a pervasive problem in society.
The debate on seed oils is fervent and nuanced. So, you have, and again, this is the challenge with science, right? Like, just because the nature of science, there's no truth. It's a lot of probabilistic judgments. So you have different camps of people that have different, informations that they're looking at, saying different things about the seed oil debate. And it really shouldn't be the seed oil debate as much as it should be like the polyunsaturated fatty acid debate more broadly, which is like, the predominant like type of fat that's found in these types of industrial produced oils. My take is that if you just think about a few things from first principles, they're most likely not so great. Number one, humans historically did not eat a big ratio of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So why would you want to eat something different than the like evolutionary environment that your preceding ancestors created, right, or thrived in, right? And you might say, oh well, like people died at age 30, or like most people didn't even live past like 4 months old, or like they died at that birth or something. But like I just think from first principles, like it's actually crazy that if we talk about this omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, or just like the ratio of polyunsaturated fatty acids from a 6 to 3 in your body to non, it's really, really just like absurd that we're eating something that's like a 20x differential relative to like the environment that we evolved. Now you could also say like, well, we didn't sleep very well, and people were very probably malnourished, and the body was basically just designed to be able to carry on its genes, die at age 30, and then that was the brutish and short life we had. But I still just think that's crazy that we've even like normalized something that's that drastic of a difference. The second is they are like a inherent processed food. So anytime something is processed, you're taking 80 ears of corn or like, 800 sunflower seeds, and you're deducing it down into like an oil that's like, this big, like it has to go through a pretty gnarly chemical like extraction process in order for that to happen. Where like the actual like chemical nature of the product is changed, and there's a lot of additives and chemicals that, probably are not that great for us, in order to like get it to be something that's like shelf stable. And there's also a problem with like oxidization, where if it sits, too long out, it again changes the chemical nature of it. These things are housed in plastic bottles a lot of times. So like all that processing is just really, really bad. And if you think about that from first principles, it's like, okay, well, you're adding and changing a bunch of stuff from what nature has. Probably not that great. But then also, could an average human sit there and eat 80 ears of corn? No, they would get sick after like the fourth one, right? Yet, if you drink even like a few tablespoons of corn oil or something, like you're effectively consuming the same amount. Like how does that even compute? So that's the second big problem with it. The third big problem is when we start to get into like the actual, downstream potential problems that come from consuming way too many polyunsaturated fatty acids. And oftentimes these oils are packaged with other types of foods, right? Like if you're eating a protein bar and it has a bunch of polyunsaturated fatty acids from one of these like, corn or safflower or sunflower or canola oil things, it probably has other bad stuff in it as well. So I venture to say there's a big correlation between if there's oil, there's probably a bunch of other bad shit. But it comes down to, what's actually happening in the body if your like tissues are like way too high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. And like this is where the studies start to get a bit nebulous, and admittedly we don't have great data. So again, it's kind of just this like a judgment call you have to make, right? So I'm choosing to look at and consider certain data that says, it's not that great for me, right? There's a handful of studies that show, it can basically be disruptive to your metabolism. Some of these studies are in, rats, or like some of them are like, low populations of humans. So it's hard to like draw strong conclusions, but it's kind of like the best we have. So here's where the science gets a bit nebulous, because you have a certain amount of studies that say a high concentration of like omega-6 fatty acids or linoleic acid is like inflammation, producing and inflammatory. You probably have just as many studies, if not more, saying it's not. So it's kind of one of these situations like, who do you choose to believe? What do you ultimately listen to? The other thing is, beyond just like the blood serum levels of these fatty acids, you also have to think about your tissue composition, right? So because of this idea, we are what we eat. If we're eating way more, omega-6 fatty acids, your fat tissue, your adipose tissue, which is, even in a healthy person, it's about 10% body fat. Like that's literally 10% of your body. And if a high proportion of that is, polyunsaturated fatty acids, that is where we start to see some really, really interesting, studies that maybe aren't necessarily as, brought up in kind of this online narrative and in discourse. So there's a paper from Advances in Nutrition that says that the levels of PUFA fats, so polyunsaturated fatty acids, stored in the body tissue have increased almost 200% over the last half century. So it's not just like the ratio, which is a serum measure in your blood, but it's actually the fat tissue itself. And the reason that can cause a problem is this idea of lipid peroxidation, where like the fats in our cells kind of get like rusty from like bad free radical particles, making like the cells a little bit more like weaker and susceptible to damage. So like this increased lipid peroxidation due to like higher PUFA content in the cells, can basically contribute to like what's known as like oxidative stress, or like an imbalance between like, the production of reactive oxygen species, the body's ability to like detoxify this stuff, which ultimately can have like downstream negative impacts on DNA. It can be hard on your liver, all these different types of things. And then we see a few studies that, are a little bit, again, less like scientifically rigorous, but still interesting to at least consider and bring into the debate, where, high polyunsaturated fatty acid content in your tissue cells can be correlated with heart disease, make it harder to recover from cancer, disrupt your thyroid function, or even like change your metabolism. One of the most, interesting ones on here is it can actually impact your body's ability to produce oxytocin, which is like the love hormone. So like maybe, who knows, it could be pseudoscience, but like collectively, perhaps all the increased seed oil intake is, causing everyone to become slightly, less empathetic with one another.
That's crazy. So your body's storing these PUFAs, it's going to make you metabolically unhealthy. And this is kind of like fatty liver disease as well, right? So a lot of the fat that gets stored could also be polyunsaturated fatty acids. And that's what contributes, because there's a lot of science emerging right now that fatty liver disease, or just visceral fat in particular, is leading to a lot of unwanted health situations in many people. And I guess because the diets are really high in canola oil and whatever else, we're storing the wrong types of fat in our body.
Yeah, and it's so hard to avoid.
Yeah,
I mean, it's beyond just the CETOs. Again, it's this whole idea of polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Why is it so why is it so endemic in the society? Why do we
cheap.
have some
Incentives affect behavior.
Okay, so what you're saying is, and I'm going to reach out to it a little bit though. You're saying that the government is keeping food prices low to show inflation's low, while printing excess amounts of money to fund agendas which don't really help us, and we're getting sicker and unhealthier, and we don't know why.
Yeah, I don't believe in the whole, like Illuminati, like, cabal of people.
Oh no, I agree. I don't believe. I actually don't believe it. I don't believe it's like some centrally controlled thing.
Yeah,
it's just the incentive. Like Warren Buffett says,
just twisted webs of massive
exactly.
amounts of incentives. All
the
kind of pushing us in the wrong
outcomes.
direction.
Yeah,
exactly. So, but I do think like the way that I've seen these cycles play out in other markets is like it's just a pendulum effect, right?
Yeah.
Things have to get worse before they can get better. So it's going to reach a tipping point, where eventually there's now enough like public discourse about this stuff, some smart scientists, maybe backed by the right money, are going to start figuring out the studies. We're going to get the ways to test this stuff, and the truth is going to, or at least a better judgment call is going to come out, and then that's going to spur a wave of like entrepreneurial innovation. A lot of companies, building like vegetable oil, proof of low products. Consumers are going to start to demand it because like they're seeing it in their feeds.
Well, are they?
It's already happening.
Are they? If you go to like Restaurant Depot and those places that sell restaurants stuff, when you walk into a restaurant and you sit down, nobody, and I do, but nobody asks what
this
oil
morning
they use.
I had an omelet and I had to ask them to cook it in butter. But
I do
guess
the
what?
same
They
thing.
probably cut the butter with 8% canola oil, so like it's unavoidable. And then the eggs I'm eating, are not fed on grass. They're fed on grains. They're probably terrible additives. So like the omega-6 ratio is off on the eggs.
Yep, I agree. So I have this problem all the time when I eat out. I'm like, so when I eat out, I go for steak. Please, no oils. Just cook it on the grill and keep it as clean as possible. That's all you can do when you eat out. Because
I bring my own beef tallow to restaurants.
Do you?
Yeah.
What do? You just put it on the steak afterwards, or you give it to them to cook?
I give it to them, and half the time I get kicked out of the restaurant, and they're like, "Sir, we can't violate Los Angeles County health codes." And I'm like, "I'll take my business somewhere else."
Really? You actually bring your own tallow? But why wouldn't you just have it cooked on the grill directly?
Well, it depends, right? If you go to Thai food, they're cooking noodles. They have to use,
Okay. Yeah, they're not going to do that.
Cooking lubricant. So
yeah. I literally 90% of my eating out of steakhouses because they're pretty accommodating. They'll put it on the grill with no oils, and you can get a.
I have friends that bring their own steaks to restaurants, so I'm not even the most extreme.
When you see the inside of a health shop like a GNC vitamin shop, and I was in one the other day, and you walk around trying to get clean supplements, what do you do? I mean, I went in trying to get essential amino acids. Very basic, simple. Everything is cut with some filler, or it's got sucralose in it. All the products, all the protein powders in the health shops, they all have sucralose and additives and sweeteners and sunflower oil and whatever else. Safflower oil. Like it's got all these stabilizers and the protein bars are made. How are these called health shops when you walk in there and it's got the worst poisons for your body in these things? And I don't understand all these fitness gym guys who are pumping like huge weights and living off these supplements all day, how they're okay putting this stuff in their bodies.
Yeah, a lot going on there. It's not health, it's marketing, as with most things. But I've actually done like a bit of a 180 on supplements. Okay. I used to be like a supplement maxi. Like I was a wrestler in high school and discovered that like you could basically supercharge your body by giving it extra doses of the right things. And then I started, as I dug more into nutrition in my early 20s, I'm like, maybe these things are like, and I just have to eat healthy. And that's, I've actually done a complete about face where now I'm back. And same with all like the, like kind of more holistic doctors that we now work with, believe, which is that foods are actually calorie per nutrient less nutritious than they were dozens and hundreds of years ago. Like let's take a blueberry as an example. Like I eat blueberries, most mornings. The size of like, a natural wild blueberry, like before genetically modified crops came out like 100 years ago, it was like, the size of maybe like a pinky fingernail wild. Okay. Like if you ever get wild at the store, they're really, really tiny. Now blueberries are like the size of like, 2 thumbnails. Like they're huge. And basically what's happened is you're getting like, 4 to 6 times the calories because they pump up the sugar volume with the genetic engineering, but you're getting 1/6 the amount of nutrients. So this is across the board in a lot of different foods, even anything that's remotely processed like breads and grains, they're actually like extracting and stripping a lot of the natural, things and adding back in man-made versions of vitamins. Same thing with vitamins that you take from the supplement store, like a GNC. Oftentimes it's like a man-made version of a supplement that's like way less bioavailable. So there's just like kind of fundamental flaws and challenges in our food supply that make it, I think harder to get as many nutrients as you need. So my hot take is sort of that like no one's getting enough micronutrients and honestly no one's talking about it. So that's why I'm like very, much a fan of supplement. And like, you see a lot of functional doctors prescribe supplement routines. They work, right? Brian Johnson takes, 42 supplements a day or whatnot. Like I probably take 30. And it's you take, I've seen your cabinet, like these things work. And there's like a certain taboo against them as well. Like, oh, well, they're not pharmaceutical drugs. They haven't been studied. How do you know? But like more and more studies are coming out about a lot of these compounds. A lot of the compounds don't have great studies because, again, there's no incentive because you can't patent a supplement like you can a pharmaceutical. Sure. So it all comes down to the incentive and the vested interest. But again, all these things are just like code for the body, right? It's molecules that act on certain pathways and do certain jobs.
It's also expensive. right? So my supplement routine probably costs $2,000 to $3,000 a month. I mean, that's unaffordable for most people. But I'm willing to invest in my health, and I am able to. So I'm fortunate that I can afford that. What do you suggest for people who can't afford that much money spent in supplements every month? If they had to choose the top 2 or 3 supplements that they can afford, what should they be taking?
Yeah, so there's an 80-20 to it, obviously, right? And I'll maybe speak from like experience, because we have like aggregate anonymous data from everyone that joins Superpower. And basically most members, if you look at them anonymously in aggregate, are, by and large, like highly deficient in vitamin D. So because we're all not getting enough sunlight, we're sitting inside, recording this podcast inside. Like, even if you're sitting under a shaded tree outside, you're getting like significantly more sunlight and sun exposure to your skin, which helps with vitamin D synthesis than you would be if like you're, outside. So like basically even being outside under shade is better for you than like being inside, under no sun or light whatsoever. So most people are vitamin D deficient. And if you're not going outside enough, like it's probably a really powerful supplement. There's really, not many downsides to supplement. Like it's hard to, overdose. You want to kind of do it guided by a practitioner. That's why, we have a concierge doctor you can always text through Superpower for like a super low cost. And second would be magnesium. One of the other big challenges, like with the kind of like nutrient density in our foods that I discussed, is the soil over hundreds and hundreds of like farming cycles and all these farms throughout the years has actually become depleted of natural nutrients. Like magnesium is something that's like generally found, and it translates, right? Like it's like in the same way you are what you eat, it's like you are where you grow, right? So like if you're a potato and you are grown in a field with, like nutrient depleted soil, you're going to have way less nutrients that translate down into like the potato. So I think people need to start to wrap their heads around this idea that like, it's not just about the calorie count, and it's not just about like, the food you're eating. It's actually like, okay, well, let's think about where was it grown, how was it grown, and does that actually translate down into like a healthy micronutrient status? So magnesium is one of these things where like it's like 6x less, prevalent than our traditional more ancestral diet. It's less in the soil. It's less prevalent in the major foods we eat, and it's so critical for like hundreds of different bodily processes. And the crazy thing is, it oftentimes doesn't even show up in a serum blood test, which starts to show us like how complicated the body really is. You can't just kind of optimize for biomarkers. Like that's, I think, just the biohack tech bro, kind of reductionistic view of a lot of this stuff. And that's why I think, a lot of kind of like, current mainstream medicine is, might like turn their head at some of the things that we're doing. But, I wholeheartedly believe in it. And, it's because you could basically have normal magnesium levels in your blood serum, but that doesn't mean that your cells and like your organs are like in the pathways and the processes that need it are getting enough magnesium, because what will happen is the body will actually pull magnesium from its stores to keep it circulating in the bloodstream. So you can't always trust what's on the paper from the test. You kind of have to like think 2 or 3 derivatives deeper, which is also where, consumer diagnostic testing gets a bit nebulous and hard, because you need, smart people and smart algorithms on the other end to consider all of these things. And oftentimes it's not.
It's funny that you say vitamin D and magnesium. Those are my top 2 as well. But did you know, and it's not a trick question, the interconnectivity and relationship between the two? Because if you supplement vitamin D, you have to add magnesium to your diet.
Yep. Yeah. And you also probably have to add vitamin K too.
Yeah, K1,
because,
2, and 3.
Yep,
and then
exactly.
So I do an ADK supplement, and I have magnesium as well. And it's just because the moment you're supplementing D, you require more magnesium in your system.
So that's another thing to just be aware of, is like anytime you turn one lever, because the body's so complicated and interconnected, you're actually tuning thousands of micro levers.
What dosage do you recommend for the average person? I mean, I take 7,000 IUs of vitamin D a day. I'm dark-skinned. I don't get a lot of sun. And even when I do, the melanin in my skin blocks the sun. Yeah. So I have to take high levels. Otherwise, I'm deficient. Magnesium, I'm on about 600 milligrams a day supplementation. And I take a combination of threonate and glycinate.
Before bed?
Before bed.
So
the threonate I take in the morning.
You do? Okay.
It's better for focus and stuff.
Yeah.
And then the glycinate before bedtime. But what would you recommend?
It's about within the range that our medical team recommends for folks. The thing I'd maybe consider adding is another form like magnesium citramate or something.
Yes, it's citrate. Citramate or citrate?
I'd have to look at it.
I think it's citrate.
Citramate is a brand. So
yeah.
citrate.
So it's probably citrate.
Yeah,
'cause I take Magtine.
Okay.
And then so the problem with citrate is it gives you like loose bowels because it basically pulls the water into your gut.
But to be fair, most people probably could use a little bit of added gut motility. So
okay,
that's why our team isn't afraid of it.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, because I've experimented with that as well. But this is the stuff which I think people need to appreciate. That you need to understand your body. You need to experiment a bit. You need to figure out what supplements to take, but you also have to prioritize based on your budget as well.
Yeah.
Not everyone can afford to take 30 supplements a day. But find the stuff that's most important, and you do that by identifying your biomarkers, seeing what's really outside the reference range, and then try to bring it back in and make sure that nothing else pops out while you're doing that. So what is the future of health when it relates to technology and how you use technology to monitor and make better decisions on your health?
So it feels ridiculous, right? That we, can pull up our phone and see what any of our friends are doing at any time, or what anyone's doing anywhere in the world. But like, we have just like such minimal intelligence or understanding of what's happening, 2 inches below the surface, right, subcutaneously. So the inevitable arc of technology is such that it just makes things easier and easier, right, and more accessible. So right now, we're at this point in time where it was traditionally like very high friction to even get, things such as like full body lab tests across a bunch of different dimensions. Like we've kind of, democratized that, built a lot of tooling around it, right? Made it as easy as ordering DoorDash so that it's simple and frictionless. But the puck's going to keep going. I got a demo a few weeks ago of a platform called Vital One, and it is a Theranos style, maybe I shouldn't use that word. The founder is a friend. He'd probably be mad at me that I'm saying this, but like, it looks like a Theranos device, right? Yeah. Like you put your blood in, it spins and you get results in 20 minutes. Okay. And, I think we're going to move to a future world where this testing is like much more real time. And right, that's probably the in-between before some form of like nanobots.
Or maybe a continuous monitor.
A continuous monitor. I mean, Apple obviously has the patent, right? Yeah. And has done some research and intelligence over the past decade for seeing if they could use the Apple Watch to be like a glucose monitor that's non-invasive, right? So all this stuff is coming. So we're basically going to get like more insights than ever in our bodies on a continuous basis, and there's going to be all sorts of types of vendors and tests and platform. And our belief is that like, there's some value that's going to accrue to those point solutions. From a business standpoint, also, value will accrue to the kind of the aggregators and the companies that can actually deliver care and help make sense of it. And that's kind of the role that we're playing with Superpower. So, but to pinpoint it, we're all going to have much more intelligence on our bodies than ever. It's going to be much more frequent and real time. Disease should theoretically be preventable. Like, barring any sort of breakthroughs in longevity therapeutics that start to target like the actual biomechanical or biochemical aspects and hallmarks of aging. Like, we're still all going to die. But it's like, what are you going to die from? Right? Are you going to die from a disease that, was the result of decades of nutrient imbalances and high stress that just kept depleting your body of its ability to like, snip cancer cells as soon as they started forming? Or, are you going to die of natural old age, which is really just more like, which organ's going to start to fail first by the time you hit like 90 or 100, right? And like, are you able to, walk 13 miles at age 90, or are you only able to like, get carted around in a wheelchair? So like that is where things are going. And, I firmly believe there should be a future where, no one gets disease. We're all much more empowered and in control. Hospital systems, the current way kind of your primary care doctor is set up is not a gatekeeper to good health. Rather, you can take health into your own hands, and, having like a amazing, incredible doctor and health solutions available at your fingertips as frictionless as Uber or DoorDash, like that is the standard that, we believe in and what we're trying to build.
So, Jacob, what is your favorite book?
The Power of Now. So, mastering your subconscious mind and understanding how your brain really, really works, being able to shut off, the kind of neurotic little voice that might be running inside our heads, and becoming much more, interoceptively aware of like the state that our body is in is a superpower. And it's a really, I think, like challenging skill to try to cultivate because like we're not taught anything. And this book kind of just helps you become more aware of like how your consciousness works. And it certainly has like transformed the lens through which I, view my own brain and how it pertains to my body and my environment and all the things that I that I think we're not ever taught this. It's a muscle that you have to exercise, right, to kind of get a handle on like how your brain actually works and how your consciousness works. And this book has given me like a kind of a much deeper appreciation for spirituality, the nature of consciousness, and how to not let challenging thoughts live rent free in my own head.
That's great. I haven't read that one. That's gonna go on my shelf next. Thank you. What's number one piece of actionable advice you can give the audience today? Like you listen to a podcast for a whole hour and a bit. Thanks for listening, guys. What's the one takeaway that you would tell people to go do? Just action item. Go do this today.
Yeah, I'd honestly, rather than like a tactical thing, besides maybe avoiding vegetable oils or drinking filtered water, I think just be skeptical. Honestly, like the Steve Jobs quote is like, the whole world was created by people no smarter than you. But I think you can almost apply that quote in a different way to the current state, which is like the current standards are like, common acceptances of what's healthy and what's good for us, was created by people who, are no smarter than you and like might not even have our best interests in mind because, just if you follow the incentive. So yeah, I think my big takeaway would just be when it pertains to health, be really, really skeptical and think for yourself, do your own research, which is hard, right? And that's kind of why we're building what we're building, because it can be an intractable problem. But yeah, I think just think for yourself and be cautious of what to trust.
That's great. Great advice. If you lost everything and you had $100 left to rebuild, what would you do?
I'd buy some vitamin D and magnesium.
Keep yourself healthy. If you go back in time and meet one person in history, who would it be and why?
I'd go back and meet the Chinese ruler that built the terracotta empire. I think it's such a fascinating engineering feat. And the funny thing is, we've been talking about a lot about toxins and heavy metals. He actually died because he believed that mercury was an elixir.
Oh my
so
gosh.
He died in his early 30s because he would, for years was drinking this stuff, and obviously it's very, very challenging for the body to detox from. But when they discovered the terracotta army, underground, they found like these carved pathways that they believe, from the literature, were actually had like mercury flowing, and they found deposits, unusually high levels of mercury in like the surrounding soil. So yeah, I think it's just really, really fascinating that in a time with no CAD, computer designs, and nothing but just like, the sheer willpower of hundreds of thousands of craftsmen and laborers, like they were able to build this like massively striking, piece of art.
That's amazing. Jacob, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been amazing. Where can people find you or learn more about your company?
Yeah, you can find us at superpower.com, and I'm on Twitter at J__CUB. It's Jacob.
Thank you,
Vinny.
Jay.